Christmas morning should have been one of the happiest days of my life. I woke up before sunrise because I was too excited to sleep. For weeks, Mom and Dad had talked about our family's holiday overseas. Every time they packed another suitcase or bought something for the trip, I smiled because I believed I was going with them. I carefully folded my favorite clothes into my small travel bag and imagined looking out of an airplane window for the very first time. The airport was full of Christmas lights, laughing families, and children running around with excitement. My younger brother, Kelvin, couldn't stop talking about the beach resort where we were staying. Dad smiled proudly at him while Mom fixed his jacket and took dozens of pictures. I stood beside them with my passport in my hand, waiting for Dad to call me over to the check-in counter. Instead, he turned around with a strange look on his face. "Toriro," he said quietly, "you're staying here. We only paid for 3 tickets." For a second I thought he was joking. I even forced a small laugh. "What do you mean? My ticket must be with yours." "It isn't," he replied without looking at me. "You're old enough to stay behind." I looked at Mom, hoping she would say something. Nothing. She couldn't even meet my eyes. "Mom, please tell me this isn't true." She lowered her head and softly whispered, "We'll talk when we get back." Before I could say another word, Dad picked up the suitcases and walked toward the departure gate. Kelvin glanced back only once before following them. Not a single one of them stopped. I stood there frozen, still holding my passport, as the 3 people I called my family disappeared into the crowd. Minutes later, I walked to the huge glass window overlooking the runway. I watched their airplane slowly move across the tarmac before lifting into the bright Christmas sky. I kept staring until it became nothing more than a tiny dot. Then it disappeared completely. That was the moment I realized they hadn't just left me at an airport. They had left me behind in their lives. Standing there at the airport, watching the plane disappear into the clouds, I finally understood something I had been trying to ignore my entire life. That day didn't happen because of one sudden decision. It was the result of years of being treated like I mattered less than my younger brother. Looking back, the signs had always been there. Every Christmas morning, Kelvin woke up to piles of expensive presents. The newest phone, gaming console, brand-name clothes. Whatever he pointed at in a store, Mom and Dad somehow found a way to buy it. I would open my gift and usually find a notebook, a pair of socks, or sometimes nothing at all. If I looked disappointed, Mom would smile and say, "You're a good girl. You understand." When Kelvin turned 16, Dad surprised him with a brand new car. The whole family celebrated as if he had won an award. A few months later, when I asked if they could help me buy a used laptop for school, Dad didn't even look up from his newspaper. "If you really need it," he said, "get a part-time job." So I did. Every afternoon after school, while my classmates went home to rest, I worked at a small grocery store. I stocked shelves, cleaned the floors, carried heavy boxes, and saved every dollar I earned. That money paid for my books, my clothes, my bus fare, and eventually even my school supplies. No one offered to help me. No one even asked if I was tired. Meanwhile, Kelvin never had to worry about money. His school fees were paid without question. He attended one of the best private schools in the city. Every year, Mom and Dad proudly attended his school events, cheering louder than anyone else. I still remember standing on the stage after winning an academic award. I searched the crowd, hoping to see my parents smiling at me. Their seats were empty. Later that evening, Mom apologized. "We couldn't come," she said. "Kelvin had football practice." It wasn't the first time. It wasn't even the 10th. Whenever there was a choice between us, they always chose him. Family vacations became another painful reminder. Every school break, they packed their bags and took Kelvin somewhere exciting. They came home with hundreds of photos, funny stories, and expensive souvenirs. My gift was usually a cheap keychain or a refrigerator magnet. "You wouldn't have enjoyed it anyway," Dad would say. I stopped asking if I could go. I already knew the answer. One night, after another argument about money, I finally asked the question that had been living inside my heart for years. Why is everything always about Kelvin? Why am I never enough? Dad looked at me with complete confidence, as if the answer was obvious. Because he's the future of this family. Mom nodded without saying a word. Those 6 words stayed with me for years. They weren't just choosing my brother. They were telling me that, in their eyes, I had never been part of the future at all. I don't know how long I stood there watching the empty sky. The airport slowly became quieter as more flights took off. Families who had been laughing only minutes earlier disappeared behind the security gates, leaving me standing alone with my small travel bag still at my feet. I tried to stay strong, but I couldn't anymore. I found a quiet corner near a large window, sat down, and buried my face in my hands. For the first time in years, I let myself cry. Not the kind of crying where a few tears fall. I cried so hard that I could barely breathe. It felt like my heart had finally broken after carrying too much pain for too many years. A few minutes later, I heard a gentle voice. "Young lady, are you all right?" I quickly wiped my face and looked up. An older man with gray hair and kind eyes was standing a few feet away. He was dressed in a simple but elegant suit and carried a small leather briefcase. He didn't look impatient or curious. He looked genuinely concerned. "I'm fine," I lied. He smiled softly. "No, you're not." For some reason, those 3 words broke the wall I had built around myself. He sat down, leaving enough space so I wouldn't feel uncomfortable. "My name is Ibrahim Sissoko," he said. "My flight has been delayed for another 2 hours. Would you mind keeping an old man company?" I gave a small nod. For a while, neither of us spoke. We simply watched airplanes land and take off. Finally, he asked, "Who left you here?" I looked at him in surprise. "How did you know someone left me?" He pointed toward the passport still tightly held in my hand. "People who are traveling don't hold their passports like that. People who have been abandoned do." I looked down at my hands and realized he was right. Slowly, I told him everything. I told him about Kelvin always coming first. About working after school while my brother enjoyed life. About Christmas morning. About my father telling me they had only paid for 3 tickets. About my mother looking away instead of standing up for me. When I finished, I expected him to tell me how sorry he felt. Instead, he looked straight into my eyes and said something I would never forget. "Never spend your life begging people to choose you." I stayed silent. He continued, "The people who cannot see your value today may never see it. Don't waste your future trying to earn love that should have been given freely. Build a life so full that you never need anyone's permission to believe in yourself." Those words settled deep inside my heart. For the first time that day, I stopped feeling like a victim. A few minutes later, Ibrahim checked his watch and smiled. "I think it's time I introduced you to someone." He pulled out his phone and made a quick call. About 20 minutes later, another man walked into the airport cafe. He was tall, friendly, and carried a laptop bag over his shoulder. "Toriro," Ibrahim said. "This is my old friend, Lunga Masiko. He's helped many young people find opportunities when no one else believed in them." Lunga shook my hand warmly. "It's nice to meet you," he said. "Ibrahim doesn't recommend people unless he sees something special in them." I almost laughed. "No one has ever called me special." Lunga smiled. "Maybe you've just been surrounded by the wrong people." That simple meeting lasted less than an hour. At the time, it felt like nothing more than a conversation between strangers. I had no idea that the people I met on the worst day of my life were quietly opening the door to the future that would change everything. The day I left the airport, I made myself one promise. I would never spend another day trying to convince people to love me. Ibrahim's words stayed in my mind every morning and every night. Whenever life became difficult, I repeated them to myself. Instead of chasing the family that had walked away from me, I decided to chase the future I wanted. Few weeks later, Lunga called me. "I found a scholarship program," he said. "Your grades are excellent. Apply for it. You've got nothing to lose." I spent days filling out forms, writing essays, and gathering every document they asked for. When the acceptance email finally arrived, I read it 3 times before I believed it. I had won a full university scholarship. For the first time in my life, someone had chosen me because of my hard work. University wasn't easy. The scholarship covered my tuition, but it didn't pay for everything else. I still had rent, food, transport, and books to worry about, so I worked. During the day, I attended classes. At night, I worked long shifts at a customer support center. Some nights I didn't get home until after midnight. I would eat a simple meal, study until my eyes refused to stay open, sleep for a few hours, and wake up to do it all again. There were days when I was so tired that I almost gave up. But every time I remembered the airport, I kept going. I rented a tiny apartment that was barely big enough for a bed, a small table, and a second-hand chair. The paint was peeling from the walls, and when it rained, water sometimes leaked through the ceiling. I couldn't afford fancy furniture, so I bought most of my things from second-hand shops. Even then, I felt proud. It wasn't much, but it was mine. Slowly, I became interested in technology. I loved solving problems and creating things that made people's lives easier. After classes, I spent hours watching free online lessons, teaching myself programming, and building small software projects on my old laptop. Many of my first ideas failed. Some apps never worked properly. Some businesses ignored my emails. Some investors never replied. But every failure taught me something new. Instead of quitting, I kept learning. After graduating, I started a small technology company with almost no money. My office was nothing more than a tiny rented room with 2 old desks and unreliable internet. Most days I was the CEO, the programmer, the receptionist, and the cleaner all at once. There were months when I wondered if I would have enough money to pay the bills. Then one client became 5, 5 became 20, 20 became hundreds. Little by little, the company began to grow. 4 years passed faster than I expected. During all that time, I never called my parents. Not once. I never sent a birthday message. I never asked how they were doing. The truth was, they never reached out either. No phone calls. No emails. No Christmas cards. No apologies. It was as if the daughter they had left at the airport had simply disappeared from their lives. First, that silence hurt. Then it became peaceful. Because while they were busy forgetting about me, I was quietly building a life they could never have imagined. 4 years passed, and while I was building my future one step at a time, my family's perfect world slowly began falling apart. Dad had always believed his transport company could never fail. 4 years, it had earned enough money to give Kelvin everything he wanted. Whenever people praised Dad's success, he would proudly say, "I've built something that will last for generations." But business doesn't care about confidence. It only cares about good decisions. The first warning came when several of Dad's biggest clients ended their contracts. Then fuel prices increased, repair costs became more expensive, and new competitors entered the market with better prices and newer trucks. Month after month, the company's profits became smaller. Dad kept telling everyone it was only a temporary problem. "It'll be fine," he said at every family dinner. "Business has good years and bad years." But this wasn't just a bad year. It was the beginning of a disaster. Instead of saving money, Dad started borrowing more. He believed one big contract would fix everything. He signed new loan agreements, bought more equipment, and hoped the company would recover before the bills became due. Didn't. At the same time, Kelvin decided he wanted to become an investor. He had no real experience, but he was full of confidence. He watched a few online videos, listened to people promising quick profits, and convinced himself that making money was easy. He invested almost everything he had into risky business deals. Then he borrowed even more money to invest again. For a short time, he believed he was getting rich. Then one investment failed. Another company went bankrupt. Property deal collapsed at the last minute. Within months, almost everything he had was gone. Instead of making money, Kelvin was drowning in debt. The pressure inside the house became unbearable. The sound of laughter disappeared. Family dinners turned into long, silent evenings filled with unpaid bills, bank letters, and worried faces. Dad stopped sleeping well. Every morning he woke up before sunrise and spent hours staring at financial reports, trying to find a solution that wasn't there. Mom quietly sold her jewelry, hoping the extra money would help pay some of the debts. She never told anyone until Kelvin accidentally found the empty jewelry box. Even that wasn't enough. Soon the phone started ringing every day. Banks wanted their payments. Suppliers demanded the money they were owed. Creditors refused to wait any longer. One by one, the banks rejected every new loan application. The answer was always the same. "I'm sorry. We can't approve your request." For the first time in their lives, money could no longer solve their problems. Their savings were gone. Their business was collapsing. Kelvin's investments had become a nightmare. And the family that once believed they had everything suddenly realized they had nowhere left to turn. That was when they started searching for someone who could save them. The last person they ever expected was the daughter they had left behind at an airport 4 years earlier. After every bank turned them away, Dad had no choice but to look for private investors. He spent weeks making phone calls, sending emails, and asking old business contacts for help. Most people either ignored him or politely said no. One afternoon, just as he was about to give up, an email arrived. A fast-growing technology company wanted to discuss a possible partnership. They had reviewed his business proposal and invited him to a meeting at their headquarters. Dad couldn't believe it. "This could be our last chance," he told Mom and Kelvin. "If this meeting goes well, we might be able to save the company." The email included the company's name. Sounded strangely familiar. Dad frowned as he read it again. "I've heard this name before," he muttered. But he couldn't remember where. The morning of the meeting, the three of them dressed in their best clothes. Dad carried a folder full of financial reports. Kelvin spent the drive talking about how they should ask for a large investment. "They'll be lucky to work with us," he said confidently. Dad didn't answer. For the first time in years, he looked nervous. When they arrived, they were surprised by the size of the building. It was a modern glass tower with the company's logo shining above the entrance. Inside, everything looked clean, bright, and professional. Employees walked through the lobby with confidence, greeting one another with smiles. A receptionist welcomed them warmly. "Good morning, Mr. Benson, we've been expecting you." She handed them visitor badges and asked them to wait for a moment. A few minutes later, another employee arrived. "This way, please." They followed him through long hallways lined with awards, newspaper articles, and photos of successful projects. Dad couldn't help looking around. "Whoever built this company knows exactly what they're doing," he whispered. They finally reached a large boardroom with glass walls. The employee opened the door. "Please go in. The CEO will be with you shortly." Dad stepped inside first. Kelvin and Mom followed. At the end of the long table, someone was already sitting in the CEO's chair, quietly reading a file. She slowly closed the folder. Then she looked up. Dad's face turned completely white. Mom covered her mouth with both hands. Kelvin stood frozen, unable to say a single word. The successful young CEO sitting in front of them wasn't a stranger. It was Toriro, the same daughter they had left alone at the airport 4 years earlier. She wore a simple business suit, and there was a quiet confidence in her eyes that none of them had ever seen before. She didn't look angry. She didn't look nervous. She looked like someone who had worked hard for every single thing she had achieved. For several long seconds no one spoke. The room was so quiet that they could hear the clock ticking on the wall. Finally, Toriro broke the silence. She looked at them with calm, steady eyes and said, "Good morning. Please have a seat." Those 5 words hit them harder than any shout ever could. Because the daughter they had once believed didn't matter was now the woman holding the future of their company in her hands. For a long moment nobody moved. Dad stared at me as if he couldn't believe what he was seeing. Mom's eyes filled with tears almost immediately. Kelvin looked from me to the office around us, still trying to understand how the sister he had ignored for years had become the CEO of a successful company. Dad was the first to speak. "Toriro," he whispered. "Is this really your company?" He nodded. "Yes. Please have a seat. We have a business meeting scheduled." They slowly sat down across from me, but no one touched the papers in front of them. Instead of talking about business, Mom suddenly began crying. She covered her face with her hands. "I've missed you so much," she said through her tears. "Not a single day passed without thinking about you." I looked at her quietly. Those words would have meant everything to me 4 years ago. Now they felt strangely empty. Dad cleared his throat. "We made mistakes," he said. "Things happened. Life became complicated. Before I could answer, Kelvin leaned forward. Toriro, whatever happened before, we're still family. Families don't stay angry forever. We should help each other. I looked at him for a few seconds. It was the longest conversation we had shared in years. The funny thing was, he hadn't called me once during those 4 years. Not on my birthday. Not at Christmas. Not even to ask if I was alive. Yet now the word family came so easily. Without saying a word, I opened one of my desk drawers. Inside was a small clear envelope. I carefully took something out and placed it on the table. It slid across the polished wood until it stopped in front of Dad. He looked down. His hands started shaking. It was an old airport luggage tag. The paper had become worn with time, but it was still readable. Attached to it was the small tag from the travel bag I had carried that Christmas morning. I had kept it all these years. Not because I wanted to remember the pain, but because I promised myself I would never forget the lesson. Mom slowly picked it up. The moment she recognized it, she burst into tears. Her shoulders shook as she held the tag in her hands. Dad couldn't even look at it. He lowered his head and stayed silent. Finally spoke. My voice was calm. I wasn't shouting. I wasn't crying. I simply asked one question. Do you remember where you left me? No one answered. The silence inside the boardroom felt heavier than any words. Kelvin looked at the luggage tag, then at me. For the first time in his life, he had no excuse. Dad opened his mouth as if he wanted to explain himself. Nothing came out. Mom whispered, "I'm so sorry." But even those words felt too small for what had happened. I leaned back in my chair and looked at the 3 people sitting across from me. 4 years earlier, I had stood alone at an airport, watching their plane disappear into the sky. Today our positions had changed. They were the ones asking for help, and I was the one deciding what happened next. The silence in the boardroom lasted for several seconds. Finally, Dad took a deep breath. "Toriro," he said quietly, "there's something we don't understand." He looked around my office before looking back at me. "How did you build all of this? 4 years ago you had nothing. You were alone. Where did you get the money to start a company like this?" Before I could answer, there was a knock on the door. "Come in," I said. The door opened, and a man in a dark suit walked into the room carrying a leather folder. Dad immediately recognized him. "Akin?" he asked in surprise. It was Akin Bailwa, the lawyer who had handled our family's legal matters for many years. He greeted everyone politely before taking a seat beside me. "I believe it's time everyone knows the truth," Akin said calmly. Dad looked confused. "What truth?" Akin opened his folder and carefully removed several documents. "Many years ago, before Mrs. Miriam passed away, she came to my office without telling anyone. At the mention of my grandmother's name, everyone became quiet. Grandma Miriam had always been the only person in the family who made me feel loved. She never treated Kelvin and me differently. She always told me, 'Your kindness is your strength. One day people will see it.'" Akin continued. "She asked me to create a private education trust in Toriro's name." Mom's eyes widened. "What? We never knew about that." Kin nodded. "That was exactly how she wanted it. She instructed me not to tell anyone until the right time." Dad leaned forward. "Why would she keep something like that a secret?" Akin looked directly at him before answering. "Because she believed Toriro would one day have to stand on her own." The room became completely still. He handed a copy of the trust documents to Dad. Mrs. Miriam wrote a personal letter that was to be opened only after the trust was used. With my permission, Akin unfolded the letter and began reading it aloud. "If you are reading this, it means my granddaughter has finally needed the help I always feared she would. Toriro has a kind heart, but kindness is often mistaken for weakness. I have watched the way she is treated, and I worry that one day she may have no one to depend on. That is why I created this trust. I cannot protect her forever, but I can give her the chance to build a future with her own hands." By the time he finished reading, Mom was crying again. Dad couldn't say a word. His hands shook as he held the letter written by the woman who had known him better than anyone. Akin gently closed the folder. "The trust paid for Toriro's education after she earned her scholarship. When there was money left, she invested it wisely and used it to launch her first technology business. She didn't become successful because someone handed her a fortune. He smiled at me. She became successful because she worked harder than most people ever will. Dad slowly looked at me. So, your grandmother believed this would happen. He nodded. She was the only person who saw what I was going through. For the first time, my parents understood something they had refused to see for years. The daughter they had abandoned had not been saved by luck. She had been believed in by the one person who truly loved her, and she had turned that belief into a life no one could take away. After Akin finished speaking, everyone in the room looked at me. No one said a word. They were all waiting for my decision. Dad slowly pushed his chair back and looked at me with tired eyes. Toriro, he said quietly, our company is running out of time. If we don't find help soon, we'll lose everything. Mom reached across the table with tears still in her eyes. Please, she whispered. We're your family. Kelvin nodded. We know we made mistakes. Just tell us how much money you can invest. We'll pay you back. I promise. I listened carefully without interrupting. 4 years earlier, I would have done anything just to hear them say they needed me. Now everything was different. I wasn't angry anymore. But I wasn't the frightened girl standing alone at the airport either. I opened a folder that had been sitting on the table from the beginning of the meeting. I've already studied your company, I said calmly. Your biggest problem isn't bad luck. It's poor management, risky decisions, and spending money without a long-term plan. Dad lowered his head. He knew I was right. I pushed several documents across the table. I am willing to help. The three of them looked at each other with relief. Before anyone could celebrate, I continued. But not in the way you expect. Their smiles disappeared. I will not give you free money. The room became quiet again. I won't write a blank check. I won't pay off your debts. And I won't rescue the business simply because we're related. Mom looked disappointed. But we're family. I gently shook my head. Family should have stood beside me when I needed them. Family doesn't only matter when money is involved. No one argued, 'cause no one could. I pointed to the papers in front of them. This is a business partnership. Dad picked up the first page and started reading. Under the agreement, my company would provide technology, financial planning, and business support to help rebuild the transport company. In return, the company would follow strict financial rules, independent audits, and professional management. Every decision would be transparent. No secret spending. No risky investments. No special treatment for anyone. Kelvin looked surprised. So, you're not taking over the company? No, I answered. I'm giving the company a chance to survive. What you do with that chance is up to you. Dad continued reading in silence. Finally, he looked at me. These conditions are very strict. They have to be, I replied. That's how successful businesses are built. Mom quietly asked, and if we refuse? I closed the folder in front of me. Then I wish you the best, but I won't invest. They looked at each other again. For the first time in their lives, they realized they couldn't use guilt, tears, or family words to change my mind. This wasn't about emotions. It was about responsibility. I stood up from my chair and looked at each of them. Then I said the words I had learned after the hardest day of my life. Help is earned. It isn't demanded. The room fell silent once more. A few years earlier, I had begged my family to choose me. Now they were the ones hoping I would choose them. The difference was that I wasn't making my decision with my heart alone. I was making it with wisdom I had earned through every lonely day, every sleepless night, and every step that had brought me this far. The next few months were not easy. Saving the transport company took much more than money. My team worked closely with Dad's employees to rebuild the business from the ground up. We introduced better technology, improved delivery schedules, reduced unnecessary expenses, and created a clear financial plan. Every dollar was carefully tracked, and every decision had to follow the new agreement. At first, Dad struggled with the changes. He had spent years believing he always knew best. Now he had to listen to people who understood the business better than he did. Slowly, He accepted that pride had almost destroyed everything he had worked for. Little by little, the company began to recover. Old customers returned. New contracts were signed. The unpaid bills became smaller each month. For the first time in a long while, the business was moving forward instead of falling apart. One afternoon, Dad asked if we could talk alone. We sat quietly in my office. After a long silence, he looked at me with tears in his eyes. "I failed you," he said. "Not just at the airport, but for most of your life. I kept believing your brother deserved everything while expecting you to accept whatever was left. There is no excuse for what I did." It was the first honest thing I had ever heard him say. Few days later, Mom visited me. She hugged me tightly and cried. "I should have protected you," she whispered. "Every time I stayed silent, I hurt you. I can never change the past, but I will spend the rest of my life trying to become a better mother." For the first time, I believed her. Then Kelvin asked to meet me. He looked very different from the confident young man I remembered. Life had humbled him. "I'm sorry," he said. "I grew up thinking I deserved everything because Mom and Dad always treated me that way. I never stopped to see how unfair it was to you. I can't take back those years, but I truly regret them." I smiled gently. "Thank you for finally telling me the truth." Forgiveness didn't erase the past. It simply allowed all of us to stop living inside it. A few weeks later, I packed a suitcase and returned to the same international airport where my life had changed 4 years earlier. This time everything felt different. I wasn't carrying fear. I wasn't carrying heartbreak. I was carrying a passport, a boarding pass, and a future I had built with my own hands. When the airline agent smiled and said, "Welcome, Ms. Toriro. Business class is this way," I couldn't help smiling back. As I walked through the airport, I passed the same large windows overlooking the runway. For a moment I stopped and looked outside. 4 years earlier, I had stood there crying as my family's plane disappeared into the sky. Today, I wasn't waiting for anyone to choose me. I had already chosen myself. A few minutes later, I settled into my business class seat. As the airplane began moving down the runway, I looked out of the window and watched the ground slowly disappear beneath the clouds. This time I wasn't being left behind. I was flying toward a future filled with peace, confidence, and hope. I closed my eyes, smiled, and quietly whispered to myself. 4 years ago, they left me alone at an airport because they believed I didn't matter. 4 years later, they stood at my office door hoping the daughter they abandoned would save them.